So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk for a few minutes about how I got the idea to tackle the subject of habits. Then I'm going to answer 3 threshold questions about the nature of habits that have probably occurred to you if you've thought about trying to change your habits, or perhaps the habits of somebody else. And then I'm going to throw out some surprising things about habits, things that I did not know when I started and that have really helped me change my habits. And then we're going to have time for the conversation with Karen, which is going to be the best part, I'm sure. So I turned to the subject of habits because I've been reading and thinking and talking to people about the subject of happiness for years. And I began to notice a pattern that was often when people talked about a big boost that they'd gotten in their happiness, or more often a challenge, a persistent challenge that they were facing in their habits, in their happiness, it was something that at its core was really related to a habit. So somebody would say like, oh, I'm just exhausted all the time. But really that's about the habit of going to sleep on time. And so I became more and more interested in this subject of habits. And then I went to lunch with a friend, and she said something that turned my interest in habits into a full-blown obsession. She said very casual, she said, oh, well, I know what would make me happier is if I exercised regularly. And the thing is, when I was in high school, I was on the track team, and I never missed track practice. But I can't go running now. Why? And I thought, well, why? Why? Same person, same behavior. And at one time it was effortless, and now she can't do it. So what is going on? And I became determined to solve the puzzle of habits. And as I got into it, I got more and more interested, but then I also became increasingly frustrated because everybody that was writing about habits seemed to not notice questions that seemed very obvious and pressing to me, which is there's always this sort of assumption that we all have the same aptitude for changing our habits, or that we all have the same attitude toward habits. And that just seemed to me like obviously not true from just looking at the people in my life. It's easy perhaps to understand why we can't change a habit to do something that we don't like to do. But why is it that it's often just as hard to do a habit of something you love to do? Like maybe you can't get yourself to cook every night because you don't like cooking. But what if you love to cook and you can never get yourself to cook? What's up with that? Or why is it that most successful dieters gain all the weight back and more? Why is it that sometimes habits change overnight, and sometimes we drop them just as suddenly? Or we work on them for years and can't form them? Or anyway, it just goes on and on and on. And I was like, I am going to figure this out. I'm going to solve the puzzle of habits. But first I had to tackle sort of 3 threshold questions. And the first is, well, should you even care about habits? Like, is it even a subject that's worth studying? Research shows that about 40% of what we do every day is governed by habits. Habits are the invisible architecture of everyday life. If you have habits that work for you, it's going to be a lot easier to be happier, healthier, and more productive. And if your habits don't work for you, it's going to be a lot tougher. Habits shape our existence and our future, so they matter. Okay, well then, so what do you mean by a habit? And I use habit very colloquially. Like I'm in the habit of meditating, or not in my case. And a lot of times when people talk about a habit, they focus on frequency or repetition or the familiarity of the cues around a behavior. But I've really come to believe that the key aspect to a habit is decision making, or actually a lack of decision making. If something's a habit, it's on automatic pilot. You are not thinking, you are not deciding, it's just happening. I do not decide whether to skip dessert. I do not decide to wake up at 6 a.m. I do not decide to go to my strength training gym at 10 o'clock a.m. on a Friday morning. I've already decided this is my habit, it just happens. And this is why habits are powerful. They get us out of the difficult, draining business of using decision making and our self-control. And people often say to me like, well, I need to learn how to make healthy choices every day. And I'm like, don't make healthy choices. Make one healthy choice and then stop choosing. You know, you're not going to decide every day, what should I do for lunch? Bring my lunch or buy one when I get there from a fast food joint? No, choose once and then just put it on automatic pilot. Well, so then the question becomes like, okay, well, how do you change your habit? And that is the big question. How do you change your habit? It's a very, very important question. And that is what I decided that was better than before I was going to figure out. How do you change your habit? Now, and if you're looking for advice about how to change your habit, there is no shortage. Do it first thing in the morning. Start small. Do it for 30 days. Be good most of the week and then give yourself a weekly cheat day. But the problem is, as I'm sure you've noticed, some of these strategies work for some people, sometimes, and then they don't work for other people at other times. So what is the secret of habit change? And what I figured out is that there are actually 21 strategies that people use to change their habits. And it's the same strategy to make a habit or to break a habit. People often get very, very preoccupied on that distinction. But actually, it's the same strategies. It's 21 strategies. Now, sometimes when I say there are 21 strategies, people sort of like get this frantic look in their eye. And they're like, oh, my God, I can't deal with 21 strategies. That's too many. I can't handle that. But it's good, because 21 strategies means that there's so many to choose from. You can pick the ones that appeal to you. You can pick the ones that are going to work with your circumstances and the habits that you want to form. Because the bottom line, the real secret to habits, is that there is no magic one-size-fits-all solution. We all have to think about ourselves, what's true for us, what kind of habits we want to form, and set it up in a way that's going to allow us to succeed. So what I'm going to do today is talk about 5 things that surprised me. Now, I would love to talk about all 21 strategies because I love every strategy. They're all so effective and great. But a lot of them you kind of know, like the strategy of monitoring. Very effective, very powerful strategy. But I think you guys know, like, oh, if you want to eat more healthfully, keep a food journal. If you want to move around more, use a step tracker. If you want to stick to your budget, keep very close watch on how much you're spending. Monitoring is something that we know. It's very effective, but it's doesn't come as a surprise. Now I want to talk about things that you might not know, things that might come as a surprise. And the first is the strategy of abstaining. Now, this is a strategy, I must warn you, it works extremely well for some people, and it is completely ineffective, perhaps counterproductive for other people. So you must decide whether you're an abstainer or a moderator. And this is how I figured out about abstaining and moderating. I was reading something by Samuel Johnson, who's one of my favorite writers, this 18th century British essayist. And he was at a party, and someone asked him if he would like a little wine. And he said, I can't have a little. Abstinence is as easy to me as temperance would be difficult. Meaning, I can have none or I can have a lot, but I can't have a little. And when I read that, I'm like, that's me. I can have no Thin Mints, or I can have 10 Thin Mints. I can't have 2 Thin Mints. So I'm an abstainer. Abstainers find it they're all or nothing. They find it very easy to have nothing, to take something off the table and say they're not going to have any. But if they have any, they want to go all the way. So they do better when they abstain altogether. But moderators, by contrast, get very panicky and rebellious if they're told that they can never have something. They do better when they can have it sometimes, or a little bit. And often if they know they can have something, they don't even want it. Now, and I will tell you, the sign of a moderator is that often somewhere they keep a fine bar of chocolate squirreled away. And once a day, they will have 1 square of fine chocolate, and that's all they want. And I'm like, I would be haunted all day by the thought of this chocolate bar sitting in my desk drawer or whatever. There's no way I could go the whole day without eating it, because I'm an abstainer. It's easy for me to have nothing, but I can't have a little bit. Moderators, if they try to have none, they get kind of panicky. They need to just know they can have a little. So just on the basis of this, how many people here identify as abstainers, or they know somebody who fits that pattern? Oh, right, yeah. And how many moderators? Yeah. So you see, there's lots of both. And the problem is they tell each other they're doing it wrong. An abstainer's married to a moderator, and they fight about that having ice cream in the freezer all the time. It's not a question of who's right, who's wrong. It's whatever works for you. And this is something that can work for any kind of strong temptation. It often comes up a lot in technology. My sister had to delete Candy Crush. She can't play a little Candy Crush. So get rid of it altogether. Abstaining works. And people will say, oh, but it takes so much self-control. Abstaining is easier. for abstainers. That is the easier way than trying to be moderate. Okay, there's 21 strategies. This is the strategy that's the most fun strategy, so I can't leave that out. And that's the strategy of treats. Now, a treat is different from a reward. A reward is something that you get because you've earned it, you've deserved it. A treat is something that you give yourself just because you want it. And treats, it sounds sometimes like it's a selfish or self-indulgent strategy, but it's actually very important. Studies show that when people get a little treat, their self-command rises. Like in a study, they gave them a surprise gift or had them watch a funny video, and people had more self-command. And when you're trying to keep your good habits, you want to keep your self-command high. And treats are a way to do this. Treats, it's like plugging in your cell phone. You get a little charge to your battery. You feel comforted and cared for. When we give more to ourselves, we can ask more from ourselves. But it's very important that these are healthy treats. What are the unhealthy treats? I think you know. Food and drink, shopping, technology, like binge watching House of Cards until 4 a.m. Okay, I need it, I deserve it, I want it, right? It's not healthy. You want to give yourself healthy treats because we don't want to do things to make ourselves feel better that then end up making us feel worse. So you want to have a long list of healthy treats. But it's hard. A lot of adults kind of can't think of that many healthy treats. So I was asking a bunch of people. A friend of mine has a great healthy treat. So she has to rally her family to get them out the door on weekday mornings, and then she goes back to bed when everybody's gone. Sometimes she's in her pajamas, sometimes she's dressed for work, and she just crawls back into bed and just lies there for 20 minutes in the silence. And she says it's just the most delicious thing. My husband does crossword puzzles on his iPad. I wear perfume. I work at home. I put on 2-3 times a day. I love it. One new a treat that a lot of people have been saying is that they listen to podcasts, that's like a little treat. I have a new podcast with my sister called Happier, and several people have said, like, oh, that's my little treat, is that I listen to that when I need a little treat. That's great. And I was talking to a guy, he's like, oh, I never give myself treats. And I was like, I bet you do, dude. And he actually had a great treat. Every Tuesday when iTunes releases new music, he buys himself new music. That's a great treat. So you just want to have things a menu of things that you can do so that when you get into that mode of I need it, I deserve it, I want it, you can give yourself something just because you want it that's going to make you feel more restored, because that's when you're going to be able to keep your good habit. Then there's 2 strategies, one related to beginnings and one related to endings, that surprised me. And one is the strategy of the clean slate. Now, this is a strategy that's enormously powerful, but it's not always available to us because it has to do with transitions. And usually we're not going through transition, but sometimes we are. And if you go through a transition, that is a fantastic opportunity to change your habits. So you don't want to miss out on the opportunity. It could be a transition in a relationship, a marriage, a divorce, a new baby, a new puppy, a new boss. It could be a transition in circumstance, a new school, a new job. Most often, it's a transition to a new home. And when they did a study of people who successfully changed their habits, 36% were associated with a move. So whenever you're having that transition, what happens is the slate is wiped clean, all your old habits are wiped away, and new habits can come in much more easily than if you were in your same old routine. And I used this with extreme success long before I knew anything about habits. I just happened on it. As mentioned, I went to law school, so I graduated from law school. My husband and I moved to New York, and I was getting ready to start a clerkship. And because of the logistics of it, I decided that to go to the gym, I was going to have to go before work, just the way it all worked out. And by chance, the week that I was starting my job, my judge was going to a judicial conference for a week, so he wasn't around. And so I thought, you know what, I don't really know how the timing is going to work out, because it's like I have to take the subway down there and then work out and take a shower and then walk, and it's a long walk, so I don't, And so I thought I'd better go every day this week when he's not there, when it won't matter if I'm 10 or 15 minutes late, until I really understand how this is all going to work logistically. And so that was my habit. right? This was the time I woke up. This is what I did. It just felt like that was the normal day. By the time he came back, that's the way my days unfolded. But I could just as easily imagine myself having thought something like, well, you know, it's really draining and difficult to start a new job, and so I don't want to pile too much on myself. I'm not going to go to the gym for the first couple weeks, and then I'll start to go. But by then, you know, you're like, oh, it just feels like such an imposition. I have to get up earlier. You know, it would have been very hard to do it. So we want to remember that temporary often becomes permanent. All things being equal, we tend to do things the way we've done them before. And so whenever you're going through that transition, start the way you want to continue and use that opportunity. And here's something that surprised me. It surprised me so much that I couldn't even understand it for a long time. This has to do with endings. And I figured this out because I had this very uncanny experience where several people told me exactly the same story in practically the same words, and it was something that didn't seem to make sense to me. I was like, I don't understand why this is happening to you. It doesn't make sense. And this was the story. So like I go to my college reunion and a friend tells me this story. Oh, well, the weirdest thing happened. I wanted to get into the habit of exercise, and so I decided I would train for the marathon. And I trained for the marathon, and I loved it, and I bored my family and friends telling them about training for the marathon. And then I ran the marathon, and it was amazing. And then I took off those rest days that they tell you to take, and I haven't run since. And this was happening over and over. People were telling me exactly that same story. And this to me it seemed crazy, because I was like, oh, but this is such a big accomplishment. You'd think that would energize him. You'd think he'd be totally into it even more, because he'd had this wonderful experience and like really crossed something big off his bucket list. And like, why was this happening? But it was happening to so many people. Like clearly something was going on with habit formation. And this is what it is that if you are trying to form a habit, it is very, very dangerous to hit a finish line. Because a finish line is a finish, and if you finish, you have to start over. And starting over is harder than starting. It's very hard to start over. And the more dramatic the end, the more decisive the finish, the harder it is to start over. And when we're trying to form habits, we're generally not trying to hit a goal. We're trying to shape our behavior indefinitely. And don't dwell on that, because people freak out when they think about doing something forever. So just let that be in a misty haze. But you want to do something forever. It's not that you want to do a 60-day sugar detox. It's that you want to eat more healthfully forever. It's not that you want to train for the marathon. It's that you want to be exercising forever. And so it's important not to think of it as a finish line, but as a milestone. It's a very satisfying milestone. It's wonderful to hit that milestone. But what's happening on the other side? You have to have a real plan. It's not like you break through that tape and then you're done. You have to have a plan for what happens on the other side if you want the habit to persist. And this is something that I think comes up a lot with dieting. Because what happens? Well, I weigh 160 pounds, and I have a goal weight of 140. I'm going to lose 20 pounds, and it's going to be amazing. So I go on a diet, and I lose 20 pounds, and I'm like, this is amazing. I hit my goal weight. Now I can go back to eating normally. Okay, what happens when you eat normally? You go right back to 160 and probably overshoot it. And you know, dieting is incredibly popular. Like I think in 2012, 1 out of 5 American adults is on a diet. It's not effective. And I think a lot of it is that people are managing towards a finish line instead of really focusing on how they want those habits to last forever. So it can be very satisfying to aim for something, but think of it as a milestone and really always have a plan for what's going to happen on the other side. And the final thing that surprised me, I have to say, I'm constantly surprised by this, and I was surprised. I talk about it a lot in the Happiness Project and Happier at Home. It surprised me then, it surprised me now. I can't understand this. Somebody should write a whole book about this, which is the strange and weird and disproportionate degree to which, for most people, not everybody, but for most people, outer order contributes to inner calm more than it should. Inner calm and inner self-command. There is something about getting control over the stuff of life that makes you feel more in control of life generally. And if it's an illusion, it's a helpful illusion. There is something about just getting rid of things that don't work, getting rid of things that don't fit, getting rid of things that you never liked, that, you know, or like as my husband said, he's like, I've never seen that pair of pants before in my life. Getting rid of these things, clearing shelves, clearing out space that makes people feel more creative, more energetic, and more in command of themselves. And again, with habits, what we want is we want to have a sense of self-command. A friend of mine said to me, you know, I finally cleaned out my fridge, and now I know I can switch careers. And I knew exactly what she meant. There is something mysterious to me about the degree to which outer order makes people feel pulled together. And in fact, of every habit that I have talked about for years, I'm constantly talking to people about their habits and their happiness, and I say, what worked for you? Tell me about your experience. And they, tell me about the different things they've tried, and I've heard of dozens, hundreds of things that people have tried. But the number one thing that people specifically mention as a habit that they have changed that has boosted their happiness, and I'm not saying this is the most significant habit that you could change, but I'm saying it seems to be the one that most often really works for people, is the habit to make your bed. How many people here regularly make their bed? How many people here regularly make their bed in a hotel room on the morning they check out? Yeah. A lot. Okay, we will talk later. Actually, I was coming here this morning. I posted a picture on my Facebook page of my bed made in the hotel room in LA where I checked out this morning, all nicely made. There is something about this habit. People are constantly talking about it. That it's manageable, for one thing. It's something you can really do. It gives you a feeling of, there's a big dramatic, it doesn't take that much work, and it's a big difference between a bed that's made and a bed that's not made. It's nice in the morning, and then it's nice when you come back at night. But I also think there's something special about your bed, because your bed is like a symbol of yourself. It's more like your desk than it's like a dining room chair. It's something about you. And there's something about getting control of that bed and making it look more serene and pulled together that makes you feel more that way yourself. And there's another thing, which is that one of the things that happens in habits that can be a little bit negative is that if you're trying to change a habit and you're not succeeding, it's very frustrating and demoralizing. Because one of the things that we want to feel is that we can count on ourselves. A sense of self-efficacy, that I can do the things that I set out to do. I will keep my word to myself. I can follow through. And if you say to yourself, I'm going to make my bed every day, and then you do, that is a promise to yourself that you have kept. And that is very satisfying. So there's a lot of things. It's a very simple habit, but there's a lot going on there. But I will say this. There is a sizable minority of people for whom they absolutely do not want to make their bed, and that's what makes them happy. Somebody said to me, well, when I was a child, my mother made me make my bed every day, and now I'm a grown-up and I don't have to, and I just look at it and chuckle to myself. And I'm like, okay. There is, back to what I said at the beginning, there is no magic one-size-fits-all solution. The fact that this person does it and it makes them so happy, the fact that this person does it and makes them so productive or whatever, there is no magic one-size-fits-all solution. There is nothing. This comes up all the time with the morning, right? You should do it in the morning. Unless you're a night person, because night people can't do things in the morning. They can barely drag themselves out of bed in time to get to work. If you're a night person, don't kid yourself. Like the friend of mine who's like, I'm going to get up early and work on my book. I'm like, no, you're not. I've known you for 10 years. That's not going to work for you. Don't set yourself up for failure. Do it in a way that's right for you. The fact that it looks good on paper to do it first thing in the morning doesn't matter. So the last thing I would say, and then we'll have the conversation with Karen, which I'm so excited about, is that I really do believe that even people who feel, a lot of times we feel discouraged when we can't change an important habit, or when we see somebody close to us who's not able to change an important habit. But I really do think that if you take the time to really think about yourself and what's true for you, and to think about all the options of things that you can try, that there really are possibilities that can really make people feel hopeful and encouraged about the fact that they really can tackle these habits. Because the fact is, it matters. Because if we change our habits, we change our lives. So thank you.
All right, let's get set up here. Gretchen, this is so fun. I don't know if you want some water. Bring that for you. This is great to have a chance to visit. Well, first of all, I'm so relieved that I'm not the only person that makes beds in hotel rooms.
You do that? Oh, good, good. Okay,
I do that.
There's a lot of people here, actually. Usually I'm like one of the few, but all right.
And I love the whole concept of habits. I think is so fantastic. I travel a lot for my job, and I was reading your book on the plane.
Oh.
And you know when you're on a plane and the person next to you is reading what you're reading, there's a man sitting next to me and he's sort of like one eye looking at what, and the cover is Better Than Before, Mastering the Habits of Our Everyday Lives. So I travel a lot, so I get upgraded to first class, and at one point the flight attendant came by and said, would you like a sundae? And the man sort of looks at me and puts the eyebrows up, and I said, oh no, I'm fine, no sundaes for me, because I'm mastering my habits of eating better and being better.
Well, here's a funny flight attendant story. A flight attendant told me, they were you know when they had the baskets of the free cookies and you know you can pick your free snack, and I said no, and she said, oh well, a lot of people. It was in January, and she said, oh, a lot of people don't take it in January, and I was like, how long does that last? About as long as most New Year's resolutions. Yeah. And so I thought this was interesting that like for them, she could see this pattern of like everybody's good, but and then you know they all we slip back.
Well, I loved your book. Thank you so much.
Thank
you. And I can tell you spent a lot of time and effort in putting it together. And there's so many interesting things in here. There's a lot to talk about in the short time we have. I wanted to start with the idea of community because I feel like the concept of habits are so intrinsic, right? It's your life as you're dealing with focusing on habits that you want to either improve or eliminate, things that you do to change. But I'm interested in the idea, and I know that you really talked about this in the Happiness Project too, about the idea of having people around you who support you in your journey. Yeah. So, and that's I think part of this too, and I'm interested from your viewpoint, how can those people around us help us in terms of really analyzing and supporting us in our journey on habits?
Well, one thing is you can form a group of people who want to change their habits together. And actually on my website I have a starter kit because a lot of people want to do this, where you, like an example is I know 4 people who were ABD, meaning that they had done all their coursework for their PhD thesis, but they hadn't actually turned in their thesis. And so they started a support group, and they were all in different fields. They knew nothing about what the people were writing, but it was just about, we're going to meet once a month and hold each other accountable and work on it together. Now, truth be told, they met in a bar. It probably wasn't as effective as it could have been, but it did work. And so there's something about forming a group where people give each other ideas, they give you enthusiasm, and they hold you accountable. And that's really the key thing, is that you know someone is going to be saying like, well, how did that go? And you said you were going to call that gym, and did you call, and did you make an appointment? And just knowing that.
I don't think it has to be a big group either. No. I mean, like for working out, it could just be one buddy, right? I mean, do you think that that helps?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So what about electronic communities? You know, I know that some people, we have chat rooms and Facebook, and there's sort of this sense of community that happens online. Is that the same as an in-person support group?
It's never as good. It's never as good as in person, but it's a lot easier.
It's something,
so
right?
So what you lose in like intensity, you gain in convenience, and so I think there's a place for it. I think it can be a really helpful tool. But again, it's like, you know, people have sort of different sensitivities too. Like for some people, being on a team, on an up band is going to make them very motivated. And then for some people, it's like they're only going to really feel it if it's face-to-face. So again, it's like, well, what's going to work for you? What really changes your behavior, and not just assuming like, oh, if I sign up for this thing, oh, it'll completely... this is going to help me change my habit, and then every time the reminder email comes in, you delete it without opening it. You know, so you have to use your judgment. Yeah.
So as a trialer, one of the things I do every day is I take a lot of information in complex cases and I try to make it easier to understand. Yeah. And it's one of the things I loved about your book, because you took a lot of information and you distilled it down to sort of bite-sized, manageable parts. And one part was 4 tendencies.
Oh, right, yeah.
So I thought we could talk about that, because I think it's kind of fun. And for those of you who haven't read the book yet, Gretchen really kind of spells out and takes kind of the landscape of all humans and kind of thinks about how we have certain tendencies that put us into certain categories.
Yeah.
And I read it and knew immediately what tendency I have, and I think you and I have different ones. But I think it'd be great to talk through them. So should we start with upholders?
Yeah.
Or kind of set the stage, and then we can talk about it.
Yeah. This everything in the book. This is the thing I'm most proud of. I think it's the most. It definitely was the most intellectually demanding to come up with this framework. Okay, so I'm going to explain the framework, and I have to warn you, it sounds a little boring when I get into it, but stay with me because I promise it's really...
It is good. So,
it's really juicy, but it's just like, it's very lawyerly in the way you have to set it up, so brace yourself. Okay, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to go through them very quickly, and then I'm going to go through and ask you to raise your hands because it'll be interesting for us to see who's in the audience. Okay, so this has to do with how you meet the idea of an expectation. So there's outer expectations like a work deadline or a traffic regulation or a request from a spouse. And then there's inner expectations like your own New Year's resolution or your own desire to get back into yoga. So the first category is upholder. Upholders readily meet outer and inner expectations alike. So they don't really need deadlines. They just meet those expectations. They like to know what's expected of them. But their expectations for themselves is just as important or maybe more important than outer expectations. Next, questioners. Questioners question all expectations. They'll do something if they think it makes sense. So in a way, they make everything an inner expectation. They hate anything arbitrary or irrational. They always want to know, like, why am I doing this? They love information. And so for them, it's important that they buy in, that it's not just you're telling them to do something, but they've accepted why they should be doing this. Next, obligers. Obligers readily meet outer expectations, but they struggle to meet inner expectations for themselves. So they're going to meet that work deadline, but they're going to really have trouble getting back into yoga. Like my friend on the track team. When there was a coach and a team waiting for her, she had no trouble going. But when it was just her, when she was trying to make herself go for a run, she couldn't do it because she has a lot of trouble meeting those inner expectations. And finally, rebels. Rebels resist all expectations, inner and outer alike. They don't want anybody to tell them what to do. They don't even want to tell themselves what to do. They want to do what they want to do when they want to do it. If you ask or tell them to do something, they will very likely do the opposite. So those are rebels. They resist outer and inner alike. Okay, so now let's go through.
When you think about it, I do think people fit in these 4 categories.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, and one thing people often say is like, well, I'm half upholder and half obliger. No, because upholders and obligers share the fact that they readily meet outer expectation. So what's different about them is how do you deal with an inner expectation? And really, from my judgment and my observation, people do tend to fit pretty neatly in every category. It's not, if I can sit down and grill you, I'll probably figure out that you're in tendency. But so anyway, so let's see. How many people here feel like they're upholders? They readily meet outer and inner expectations alike. And then I'll tell you how this tallies with what I usually see. Okay, this is my tendency, and I'm an upholder. And boy, I understood the world and myself a lot better when I understood that I'm an upholder. Next, questioners. Questioners question all expectations. They'll do it if they think it makes sense. Yeah. Next, obligers. Obligers readily meet outer expectations, but they have trouble meeting inner expectations.
These are the people who make every deadline but can't stay on a diet.
Yes, exactly. And rebels. Rebels resist all expectations, outer and inner alike. Okay, what I just saw is very consistent with what I see generally, which is that by far, the smallest category is rebel. And I have spoken to groups that included no rebels. But what was really surprising to me is that also a teeny tiny category is upholders. And I did not know that. When I went into writing this book, I thought I was pretty average. It turns out I'm on the freaky fringe. I'm a very extreme personality, which, by the way, came as a shock to no one but me. It's a very, very small tendency. Overwhelmingly, people are questioners or obligers. Those are the 2 main tendencies, and that's exactly what we saw in the audience.
So once you think through about what your tendency is, how do you apply that to formulation of habits and dealing with habits? So
it's absolutely super helpful to think about this.
Right.
And the first thing I would say, because there's a lot of obligers in the audience, and this is like, I think, judging from the reaction that I've got to the book, this for many people is like the light bulb that is helpful, is if you are an obliger, or if you work with an obliger, or if you have an obliger in your household, the absolutely key thing that will allow them to keep a habit or to meet an internal expectation, because they're often very frustrated that they're not meeting an inner expectation. Why is it that I can meet everybody's priorities and not mine? Why am I a people pleaser? Why do I hold myself in such low esteem that I don't do for myself what I would do for others? That's not what's going on. It's external accountability. If you create systems of external accountability for the things that you want to do for yourself, you will follow through. And this is an absolutely critical thing because this was the key that will unlock behavior for many obligers. So for instance, a friend of mine said, like, I love to read, but I never find time to read. Why do I never find time to read? But then she joined a book group where you're really expected to read the book, and she reads.
I did something similar where I signed up for an exercise class, which has an app, and then so if I sign up for the class, I have to go.
Yes, right, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. I heard about these people, they wanted to eat more healthfully, so it's like, okay, so you and I work together. So one day you bring food for 2, and one day I bring food for 2, so you have to eat what I cook because I cooked it for you, and I have to cook because otherwise you don't eat.
It's good.
It's
it
external
works.
accountability.
Yeah.
But the fact is, and I know that like in a business environment, this can be really helpful because like a sort of a sad example of this happened to a friend of mine where she had this very high pressure job. Incredibly productive and prolific. But she'd always had this dream of being a textile designer, so she thought, okay, well, I'm going to take a year off and really devote myself to this. But she was an obliger, so what happened was that she was incredibly good at working when she was part of a system where there was expectations and deadlines and supervision, but then when she was just off on her own trying to start her own business, she just stalled out. And she couldn't understand why, because it seemed like seeing how she behaved in one environment, she didn't anticipate that this would be an issue for her. And this was before I had come to understand this. And I would have said, you need to work with a coach. You need to have an accountability group. You need to have a deadline and somebody who's holding it to you. You need to come up with some kind of contract so that you had that feeling of somebody of holding it to you. So that's really important. Another thing is like, so let's say you're a questioner or you're working with a questioner or something. You have to spell it out for them why. So my husband's a questioner, and I'm an upholder, so I'll do it just because you tell me to, basically. That's the downside of being an upholder. So I wanted him, for reasons that are too boring to get into, to just take these 2 pictures that were on the wall and swap them. And I said, can you please take these 2 pictures that are on the wall and swap them? And he said, why should I? And he didn't mean it in a rude way. He just meant, why should I? Why should I? Why are you telling me that? I mean, and I'm just like, and it's exasperating, but I realized like I have to explain to him because to him it's important to know why. So if you're trying to get somebody to take blood pressure medication, for instance, things like that, it's really important to know that. And then a rebel, well, if you tell them to do something, you're very likely going to ignite the spirit of opposition in them. You've got to be very, very careful about that.
It seems like to me with rebels, you need to have them think that it's their idea in the first place. Yeah. Otherwise, they're just not going to buy into the
That's
whole
a big thing because they want to act from choice and freedom.
Yeah.
Interesting, they often will want that I'll show you is very powerful. I know a rebel, like she's a true hardcore rebel and went to Harvard. And I remember thinking, I'm kind of surprised that she could do whatever it would have taken to do to get into Harvard as a rebel because she doesn't seem like the type. And what did I discover? That in 9th grade, the guidance counselor said to her, a girl like you could never get into an Ivy League school.
That's great.
So off she went.
These 4 tendencies beyond just the book, as a supervisor for those of you who are business owners, they're fantastic. Although some of my colleagues are in the audience today, I'm going to be walking through the office later kind of thinking, okay.
It's really helpful managing teams.
Great. Yeah.
And understanding, because you can speak to people in the language that's going to be compelling to them.
Right.
Instead of just trying, because it's very hard to remember that other people see the world in a way that's different from the way that we see it. And then when you can understand that, then you can be more accommodating.
We're running a little short time, but I want to make sure we cover a couple other things that I thought were great from the book. One is this concept of the essential 7. So this is just another thing that sometimes it's like if you have your grandmother talking to you who just says to you, these are the things
I will be your grandmother.
You should be thinking about every day. So I want to run through them because I think it's, you hear them out loud and you think, oh, of course, I should be thinking about these things. And I think they generally, habits are formed around these 7 essentials. So if you think about these, and they're in the book, you'll see they're great. The first is just healthful habits, eating and drinking, right? Yeah. To me, that's a no-brainer, but we seem to always forget it.
Yeah, and people are frustrated.
Frustrated by that. The second is taking good care of yourself in terms of exercise.
Yes, exercise is like the magic elixir of life.
So we all know that. It calms
you down and energizes you.
But we don't do it.
Yeah, we don't.
It seems that one is prime for habit forming. The other is just your financial well-being.
Saving, spending, earning. Those habits are important.
And women in particular just fall down on this next one. The fourth one is just resting and relaxing because there's never enough hours in the day.
No, so many people just want to calm down, chill out, have a break, have a respite.
What about sleep? I know that's in the book.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
It's a whole other subject, but this really fits into this category.
Huge. Okay, quickly, if you have trouble turning off the light, Remember that most adults need at least 7 hours of sleep. So here's something that can really work. Set an alarm. Just like you have an alarm to wake up, set an alarm.
Oh.
And first of all, you have to have an actual bedtime, because a lot of adults are like, I'll just go to bed when I'm tired. And then they like start checking their work email, and then they go into their second wind. So actually, like, my bedtime is 10:30. So even if it's 11, I'm like, well, I'm up a half an hour past my bedtime. I at least know that. But an alarm can be a really helpful trigger for some people.
It's great. 5 is procrastination.
Oh, yeah.
That's a monkey on everybody's back.
Yeah, yeah.
And then you mentioned this earlier, just the concept of decluttering.
Yes.
Just simplifying.
Getting rid of stuff.
And lastly, which we all strive for every day, is just engaging more deeply.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit more about that one, because I love that. It attaches, it's sort of your soul and the things that really matter to you.
So there's engaging with other people, there's engaging with nature, there's engaging with God. It's like this sense of like deep engagement. And in going back to the happiness research, ancient philosophers and contemporary scientists agree that if there is a key to happiness, it's relationships. We have to feel like we have enduring bonds. We have to be able to confide. We need to be able to feel like we belong. We need to be able to give and get support. And so the habits related to relationships are important. Like you said, you've been in a book group for how long?
12 years.
12 years. Okay.
Yeah.
But so that's those relationships, these enduring long-term relationships. But a book group is a habit formation machine. It's like, it's on the calendar, so I go. And if I miss this time, I go next time. And each time, are you deciding whether to go? No, if you
Never
can go,
miss it. Yeah.
If you can go, you go.
Right.
And it's just that commitment that like, I'm gonna stick with this, I'm gonna follow through. I don't have to debate with myself like, oh, it's this thing, like, am I gonna go? Should we say yes? Should we say no? You just go.
It's powerful to have that habit.
And then by making that habit, then you solidify those relationships, and it's really from the relationships that the happiness comes.
2 more things. I loved in the book how you mentioned your sister and your kids and your husband. How do they feel about you talking about habits? How does that work out?
Well, my husband, I have to say, won't read the book. He gets like the heebie-jeebies reading. I think it's kind of like the way you feel when your first grader does her ballet solo on the school show, and you're like proud, but also, you know. Anyway, so he can't, but he's fine with it. He just doesn't want to actually read it. My daughters are sort of mildly interested the way, but you'll see at the end is a discussion of this amazing phrase that my younger daughter said, which was everyday life in utopia. And my daughter was very excited that made it into the book.
Nice.
And my sister is, she's a big character in this book, and she got a big kick out of it. And we actually just started this podcast like that.
This
I mentioned.
Is great, yeah.
Yeah. So we're these 2 sisters doing this podcast together. And I think for a lot of people who read the book, I mean, she's just this incredibly lovable, funny person. So I think a lot of people will be like, oh, I want to hear her voice, because she seems really cool.
So that's your family. But when you're meeting people along the way in your travels, do you find that people are seeking you out for advice in unexpected ways wherever you go?
Yeah. No, it's fun. It's fun. No, and I love that when people are like, okay, now let's talk about me. That's my favorite thing. I had this funny thing where I had this reporter who was talking to me. So we were talking about the book and everything, and then she's like, well, can I ask you a question? She was this.
So she's actually trying to do a story about the book, but suddenly you're giving her advice?
Yeah. Well, and then she emailed me later. She goes, I realized that you were interviewing me as much as I was interviewing you. Because I was like, well, so then what did he say? And then what did you say? Because what she was trying to do was to change someone else's habit, which is like, you know, that's challenging in its own way. And her husband wasn't taking out the trash, and it was this long thing, and they were in couples therapy, and you know, and so we're talking it through, and this and the this and the this, and like, what's all the piece? Because you know, a lot of you really do have to think it through. It's like, it isn't just like, well, tell him it's a priority, or tell him to do it first thing in the morning, whatever. I was like, you really have to kind of think about what's going on here, what's at issue. And so she emails me back a week later, and she's like, I have to tell you that reading your book and talking to you on the phone was like better than a year of therapy. My husband and I have like redesigned the habit, and now like we're both so happy, and our problem is solved.
Perfect.
Yeah, and I was
Great.
like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, thank you, Gretchen.
Thanks
so
you,
much.
Karen.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks, everyone.